Well, hello everyone, and welcome to what is the final session of the Create HDR series for this year. My name's Sue Olovich, and it's a real pleasure to be with you today to host what I know will be another really wonderful session together. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I'm joining from today, the land of the Darawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge and honour the rich cultural traditions of storytelling, of music, of dance and visual art that First Nations people have practiced for millennia. And I'm learning that these practices are not just creative expressions, rather they are living, breathing knowledge systems that connect community, country and culture in really profound ways. And I'd also like to extend deep respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are joining us today or tuning in via the recording. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You might like to acknowledge the land that you're joining us from today. And it's a really lovely way for us to connect across the spaces that we're learning in. So today's presentation, I'm so excited for. I think it's going to be a really fascinating one where Viloshini is going to explore art in the thesis journey. And as Vilo's presenting, you might like to pop in any thoughts or questions or wonderings into the chat as they come up, and we can circle back to these in the questions at the end. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Vilo Baskaran. Vilo is an educator with over 16 years of experience across secondary and tertiary settings. She's now working in educator engagement and research with a non-profit organisation, supporting school connections for children with complex health alongside a support role at a hospital school. Her doctoral research examines school connectedness through virtual inclusion for children with long-term illness, reflecting her ongoing commitment to student and teacher wellbeing. Now, Vilo is a self-confessed doodler who claims to have little artistic skill, yet she delights in finding creative ways to translate ideas onto paper. And through her work, she reminds us that while AI can support academic writing, it's our own voice that ultimately makes scholarship meaningful. So the title of Vilo's presentation today is Art in the Thesis Journey, and we're really thrilled, Vilo, that you're able to join us today and share some of your insight. So over to you to share your presentation.
Thank you so much, Susan. Good afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects as well to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues with us today. I'd also like to sincerely thank the organizing committee for the warm welcome. Thank you, Susan, and for the opportunity to share my research and thesis writing journey with you. So these are the topics that I'll be covering in my presentation. I'll talk a little bit about my research context and how I started the doodling and how it has helped me create that light bulb moment. And I'll share some studies around the use of art in making meaning and talk about the messy side of learning in a structured thesis format. And then we cannot not talk about AI these days. And so I'll talk a little bit about AI and academic writing. So starting with my research context, I completed my PhD in 2023 at the University of Auckland. My research focused on school inclusion for children with long-term illness, specifically through the use of telepresence technology. In simpler terms, my work investigated how technology can help create a virtual presence for children who are absent from school due to ongoing chronic health conditions, treatment, or recovery. The aim of the research was to understand stakeholder perspectives on ways we can support the students' sense of connectedness with their peers, with their teachers and learning, despite their physical absence from the classroom through a virtual connection with the school. I should say here at the start that my own background is not in health. I came to this project as a teacher with a deep interest in student well-being. So my interest was always about learning and connection and how the education system can support children's holistic needs. And so that's how I got on board with this project. My doctoral journey, unfortunately, unfolded during the COVID-19 pandemic, which added its own unique set of challenges. I arrived in New Zealand with my family just as the pandemic hit. Much of my study was carried out within the walls of my home, actually, balancing work from home responsibilities and family life, including caring for my two children. While this created moments of pressure and uncertainty, it also shaped the way I engaged with my research. And it was in this environment that art, especially doodling, became a surprisingly powerful tool in helping me make sense of my research process and my learning along the way. As you can see, I'm sharing some of my work on this slide. I don't know how to feel about it. I'm an avid doodler, and from my school days, my school friends know that side of me very well. You can see some of the examples here. They are definitely nowhere near Picasso or Van Gogh. Art, in my case, just simply doodling, became both a therapeutic outlet and a way of learning for me. As a visual learner, I often found that drawing helped me shape my perspectives when words alone couldn't. To try and conceptualize ideas, I would reach for my notebook and start sketching. So these doodles were not elaborate artwork pieces. In fact, they were just really quick, simple sketches on paper. But they became puzzles of their own, and they helped me see the bigger picture and at times sparked what I would call the light bulb moments. I discovered that it was easier actually to remember these concepts when I put them down on paper or had drawn them. So the art of sketching not only helped me externalize my thoughts, but also gave me a tool to recall key ideas and form deeper understanding of the concepts that I was trying to grasp. Sometimes these drawings would reflect my emotions as well at the time. And I think you can see from one of the pictures on the far right, with that squiggly lines along the side of my figure. There was frustration, fear, nervousness. There was also feeling lost along the way, especially when I was doing data analysis, and feeling like I needed to find my way out of the thick woods. So there's images there, and I also just wanted to share a little bit about the second one below on the far right, where I found ethics to be quite an interesting topic in research, and so I drew a little like a police image because that was something that I had to really focus on and develop throughout my research, was to make sure that the ethics was well prepared. So, as many of you know, the PhD journey is often described as a roller coaster with some really great highs, some exhausting lows, and plenty of unexpected turns. This has even been popularized in online comics, such as the PhD comics, and I'm sharing a couple there on the far left. And there's and these images here, they actually capture what the emotional reality of the PhD learning process is, and it's done with such great humor. I'll just give you a moment to look at that first two images from the PhD comics. Quite funny. And inspired by that kind of visual storytelling, there are more, in fact, if you wanted to go and explore, that's the whole website of it. So as I was saying, inspired by these sort of comics, I wanted to translate my own key experiences into doodles. So I sketched what it felt like to fall into a ditch and then needed support to climb back out. And this particular image, the one on the bottom, the left, is very important to me. And I made sure to put that in my thesis, actually. So it did go into my thesis. These drawings gave me a way of projecting emotions onto paper, the frustration, the confusion, the relief, and the joy. But more importantly, they helped me to contextualize the experience. So seeing the challenges drawn out visually gave me a perspective. It transformed the feelings that I was having into tangible things, which then allowed me to search for the solutions. So now let's get behind the literature of using art in learning. Whatever I have shared is not just anecdotal, As we know, there is a wide recognition in educational and neuroscience, and now we have neuroaesthetics as well, in the literature, that engaging with art can stimulate thinking, creativity, and problem solving. Let's look at that a little bit more. I'm going to rely quite heavily on my notes here because I'm going to quote some studies. So when I first started doodling during my PhD, I didn't set out to make art. It began as something quite ordinary, like small sketches in the margins of my notebook when I felt stuck or needed to think things through. Over time, these doodles became my kind of visual diary, helping me to process the ideas, emotions, and on many occasions, what am I doing moments that come with doctoral research. In preparing for this presentation, I became quite curious about what actually happens in the brain when we experience the so-called light bulb moments, or neuroscientists would refer to them as eureka moments. And these moments of sudden insight have fascinated researchers for a long time. An article published in Nature discusses a well-known study by Zhang Beeman and colleagues, and they found that a burst of activity occurs in the right superior temporal gyrus just before people become consciously aware of the solution. And this part of the brain is linked to learning, memory, and language processing. So the remarkable part is that this aha signal appears only just milliseconds before the person realizes they have found the answer, suggesting that actually insight is both spontaneous and deeply neurological. Art, it seems, can act as a gateway to those moments of insights from the work of Professor Zemir Zaki from the University College London, a pioneer in the field of neuroaesthetics, showed that viewing aesthetically pleasing art increases the blood flow to the brain's reward centers, similar to what we experience with love. So this response releases dopamine, the brain's feel-good chemical, and I think we know a lot about this, which can help us with motivation, attention, and even memory. In essence, art doesn't just make us feel good, it helps our brains make those connections more fluidly. More and more research in this field are evidencing the use of art in treating even serious illnesses. This connection between art and thinking is not just emotional, it's also deeply cognitive. I came across a BBC article that shared a recent University of Cambridge study which found that people's ability to think abstractly improved after viewing artwork in a gallery. So that's giving us some ideas there. Participants became better at seeing the relationship between ideas and at thinking conceptually. So the study's authors suggested that art actually encourages a kind of mental flexibility that is increasingly rare in our screen-based world. Now let's look at art, cognition, and learning. From a learning perspective, especially as because I'm a teacher myself, these findings are very important. Zhang and Xiao in their study explained that creative thinking unfolds in two stages: a generative process where ideas are formed, and an exploratory process where those ideas are tested and refined. Drawing fits naturally into both these stages. It allows ideas to emerge freely and provides a visual space to explore and adjust them. And in neuroscience terms, this process of drawing or using visuals engages both the brain's default network, which supports imagination and self-reflection, and its executive control network, which handles the focus and problem solving. So for me, doodling during my PhD became exactly that. So a cycle of generation where I was creating all these ideas by drawing them out, and exploration and trying to find those connections and those relationships between concepts and ideas and data especially. So when I was sketching, I wasn't just making pictures, I was externalizing my thinking, allowing my ideas to surface that otherwise might have just stayed hidden in my head. It became a quiet conversation between my mind and my pencil or whatever I was holding at that point of time. I was keen to find out if doodling did indeed help us learn better, and the science tells us that it does. So these small acts of drawing are not trivial. For example, a study by Jackie Andrade showed that participants who doodled while performing a boring listening task actually remembered 29% more information than those who didn't. I suppose we could all take a pen and start doodling when we're listening to a lecture. Andrade shared that doodling acts as a kind of mental doorstep, keeping the mind engaged just enough to prevent it from drifting away. And later studies by Mayra Fernandez found that drawing improves memory by integrating the visual, motor, and semantic information. Essentially, when you're drawing, you're not only thinking, but you're also moving and remembering all at once. And drawing brings more gains than other mnemonic techniques, apparently, as suggested by these studies. So this pattern holds true in education across disciplines. So it's not just in arts-based education, as Conher and Richard Mayer, I'm sorry for the mispronunciation of the author's name there. And in their study, they showed that students who use drawing to solve mathematical problems outperform those who didn't. And their study suggested that the act of drawing supports real-world problem solving by encouraging deeper understanding and cognition integration. And I can relate to this because I often draw when I'm teaching my children any mathematical concepts in helping them to try to understand it. And it seems to have to work better when I put it in drawing rather than trying to explain it in words. So art or drawing in this case is not only meaningful for students, but we also see these effects in older adults. A seminal study by Bolwerk and colleagues used brain imaging to show that a 10-week visual arts program increased connectivity between key areas of the brain responsible for memory, planning, and reflection. These participants, aged between 62 and 70, showed improved cognitive efficiency and imagination. So whether we are young learners or lifelong ones, drawing seems to help us think more clearly and creatively. The connection between art and insight is not new. So whatever I'm sharing here, it's not something that it's just presented recently. It's been going on for a long time in the research literature. And I want to give an example of something that I've just found out from putting this presentation together. We might know of the Ulam spiral, and I've tried to put that picture on the slide here, the blue dots. And I was surprised to find out that Stanislaw Ulam famously discovered the Ulam spiral in 1963 while doodling during a mathematics conference. So what started as an idle sketching on squared paper revealed an unexpected pattern in the distribution of prime numbers, the discovery that might not have emerged without that moment of visual play. So these are just a few examples of the vast literature that remind us that art, even in its simplest form, is far more than decoration or pastime. It is a thinking tool, like a bridge between the conscious and the intuitive mind. For me, these doodles on my desk as I was researching and writing were doing something similar. They helped me to visualize the problems, recognize the connection, and occasionally see patterns I had missed before. Some of these sketches made their way into my thesis, and I'll come back to this point later about including art in the thesis and how difficult it was for me to make that decision. But for me, these illustrations helped me to understand these conceptual relationships. How art rewires the brain and shapes understanding. So building on what we've just discussed about the neuroscience of creativity and insight, I want to turn now to how art helped me make meaning during my own thesis journey. Before I dive into that, I just want to share a little bit about the literature around this. So in the book, Your Brain on Art, How the Art Transforms Us by Susan Maximin and Ivy Ross, they explain that art doesn't simply make us feel inspired. It actually changes the structure of our brain. In their book, they quote neuroscientist Donald Hebb in saying, cells that fire together, wire together. I quite like this quote. It's quite easy to say. This simple idea underpins neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form and strengthen new connections through experience. So according to these authors, when we engage deeply with art, whether by creating it or experiencing it, our neurons communicate through bursts of electrical and chemical activity. So the stronger or more emotionally charged the experience, the more likely these neurons are to wire together into lasting connections. And they call this salience in their book. The emotional significance of an experience is really important. So the more meaningful an experience feels, the more the brain's chemistry reinforces it. And in this way, art literally rewires our brain to learn, reflect, and grow. Coming back to this point, I was doing some further reading in this and came across the work of Professor Anjan Chatterjee from the University of Pennsylvania, one of the leading researchers in this area who developed the aesthetic triad, a model explaining how our sensory motor systems, our reward circuits, and our cognitive processes come together to create what he calls an aesthetic moment. This is a moment when we experience art in a way that changes how we feel or think. It's not just about beauty, it's about making that connection and making that meaning. The third component in Chatterjee's model is what resonates with me most and relates to my presentation, which is the meaning-making system. It captures how we bring our experiences and cultural backgrounds into our interpretation of art, and how art in turn reshapes the way we interpret the world. And I'm going to share an example of how this came together in my thesis through a drawing I created of a traditional waka, or a Maori canoe. So it's on the slide here. During my PhD, I often visited the Auckland War Memorial Museum and the Auckland Art Gallery with my children. It's something that we love to do. And I remember being drawn time and again to the waka display. So the waka is the Maori canoe. Standing there, I wasn't just looking at an artifact. I was seeing a story, the people, the voyages, the survival. And the waka spoke to me of those connections, the community, and the endurance. Later, when I was analyzing my own research findings, I found myself returning to this image again and again. So in my study, which explored school inclusion for children with chronic illness, the theme of connection kept coming back. So connection to their peers, connection with teachers, and connection with school life. To make sense of how these elements work together, I began sketching the image of a double-hulled waka on the sea. As you can see on this slide, that's my drawing there. The waka became a conceptual framework in my research and was presented in my thesis. The two hulls represented the social and virtual connections that support students' learning journeys, while the sea symbolized the broader landscape of inclusive education. Through this visual process, I began to see how my data connected at a deeper level. The drawing wasn't just an illustration. It was a thinking tool that helped me recognize how cultural values, relationships, and educational practices were intertwined. It transformed what could have remained abstract into something very coherent and very meaningful to me. My experience that I've just shared reflects what Pulowski and colleagues found in their cross-cultural study of museum goers. So me going to the museum wasn't just coincidence, I think. They identified 5 patterns of engagement with art. So you start off with an indifference to having a deep transformation. Some viewers felt challenged, others comforted, but those who reported small transformations described gaining insight or meaning from the experience, even if it didn't feel life-changing. So this means meaning making can happen on a spectrum. And for many of us, these small transformations accumulate into something more meaningful, like how I connected with the visuals of the waka at the museum. Art also connects us emotionally. Maximum and Ross reminds us that knowing how your senses work is key to understanding the transformative nature of the art. The arts engages multiple senses at once. It's not just visual, so we have got sound, touch, emotion, and that multisensory simulation is what drives our neural growth. And of course, art is not limited to just what we see. It can be found in words, sounds, and movement. For some of us who experience a piece of music that moves us to tears or a line of poetry lingers in our memory, because it speaks to something deeply connected to us, right? So neuroscientists like Eugen Wasilewski, sorry, I'm again mispronouncing here, Wasilewski and colleagues have shown that poetry activates the brain's reward centers in much the same way as music, triggering chills and emotional peaks through its rhythm, imagery, and language. During my thesis writing, I began each of my findings chapter with a fakatauki. A fakatauki is called a Maori proverb. And these proverbs provided not just structure, but a cultural grounding and emotional resonance that worked well with the data that I was presenting. For example, to introduce my discussion on the importance of relationships, I used the proverb, He aha te mia nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people, it is the people, it is the people. So to discuss collective action and inclusion, I used the Fakatauki E Waka Eke Nua, the canoe which we are all in with no exception. And again, I'd like to apologize if I have mispronounced some of these words. Each proverb helped me to interpret my findings through the lens of values and connections that was really significant in the results that I was presenting. The process of pairing that data with cultural wisdom became for me another act of artistic meaning making. It turned my analysis into reflection and into a story. This integration of art, culture, and neuroscience reminds us that learning is not only a cognitive process, but an emotional one, making experiences really salient, engaging in our senses, and allowing us to see familiar things in perhaps unfamiliar ways. So for me, art became both that lens of language and understanding. It allowed me to navigate the emotional terrain of the PhD. The process of making art actually mirrored the process of the research itself, where I was journeying exploration, connection, and even transformation. Now, I'm going to go into the messiness of research and the actual writing of the thesis itself. And it's a little closer to home, I guess, for anyone who has written or is currently writing a thesis. How the research itself is a messy process and how much of that creative processes or learning is told in the thesis. Research almost is never a straight line or linear, and it shifts from question to conclusion. Yet when we read most theses, they appear to be perfectly linear, like they were always meant to be that way. In reality, as Charlotte Clark and colleagues at the Duke University write in their paper, and this is an interesting paper if you want to read it, The Messy Process of Research. And I quote, the abashedly messy aspects of the research process are often hidden from published view. Clark and her team argue that the stubbed toes along the way, the evolving research questions, the methodological surprises, the problematic answers, and even the publication dilemmas are what actually makes research rich. And in their paper, they call for us not to sidestep this messiness, but to highlight and perhaps even celebrate it. To illustrate this, I'm borrowing an image from Clark's paper, originally from author Graham, presented in 1957, a tongue-in-cheek type of research glossary. It shows how researchers sometimes use artful language, and I know we all must confess to doing this, to sidestep those awkward results or messy interpretation. And I like to draw your attention to the last one, which I think was the funniest. So in common words and phrases that we would use, we would say, it is to be hoped that this work will stimulate further work in the field of, and in actual meaning, this would translate to, this paper isn't very good, but neither are any of the others in this miserable subject. So I thought that was quite funny. It's a humorous reminder that academic prose often wears a polished face, even when what we mean underneath might be something like, we have no idea why this has happened or why this is interesting. I'm sure we've all written sentences like that. One that sounds really academic, but secretly means still figuring it out. So doctoral writing traditions, now they vary between universities, departments, and even supervisors. Some fields like the arts, design, or education allow for more flexibility, while others follow stricter conventions. Honan and Bright describe these conventions as having like a formula, a structure for most theses. We have an introduction, a literature review, we have methods, findings, discussion, and conclusion. It's like a gold standard for demonstrating scholarly competence. But for many researchers, this formula can feel quite constraining. Ruth Weatherall's article, and again, this is a really interesting piece of that you might find in that you want to read, titled "Writing the Doctoral Thesis Differently," describes that struggle. Weatherall's researched domestic violence. So her study was around domestic violence, and she engaged with persons with lived experience. And in her article, she talks about the difficulty of condensing lived experiences into a series of neatly defined chapters. And I suspect many of us can relate to this. But having said that, it's not to say that structure has no value. It certainly does. The thesis is, after all, a credentialing document, right? So it's a demonstration of scholarly skill and rigor. But we also need to keep asking, what is a thesis really for, and who is it for? And Weatherall reflects beautifully on this question. She recalls being asked how her thesis would look if she wrote it for her participants rather than her examiners. Her honest response captures a tension we rarely acknowledge. Most of us write for our supervisors, a couple of examiners, or an imagined academic audience. But what would our writing look like if we wrote for those whose stories, data, or experiences shape the research itself? The author reminds us that writing differently can actually feel very risky. So some students worry about whether their thesis will pass or whether creative approaches might harm their careers. Yet taking that risk can also open space for more authentic voices and new forms of contribution. And I'm going to refer to Thiessen's work on postgraduate writing centers on this idea of risk. Thiessen describes risk not as something to be managed, but as a productive force. And I'm borrowing a quote in saying that risk invites a connection between the messy, contradictory world that we engage with as writers of research and the institutional discourses that channel these meanings. In other words, risk helps us bridge that gap between the lived experience and academic form. And it's the edge work of doctoral writing, the testing of boundaries, negotiating between what the institution expects us to do and what we as the researchers feel compelled to express. And Gina Whiskas, another author, talks about this further in their chapter, Agency and Articulation in Doctoral Writing. She shares about how students navigate the transition between their messy, rich research process and the final, well-constructed thesis. Her research with doctoral students and supervisors found that many students struggle with this translation from exploration to actually articulation, putting the ideas onto paper. Some worry about losing their authentic voice. Others fear being judged or deviating from the traditional format of the thesis. And it's something that I personally experienced myself when I started writing my thesis. She says that acknowledging this liminal space, this in between of research and writing, can actually strengthen the final work. It's where students learn to balance creativity and conformity, and where real scholarly agency begins to emerge. Now, there's a lot of literature exploring these very tensions in doctoral writing, how we negotiate, navigate, and sometimes wrestle with the process of turning research into a scholarly text. So let's look at the image on the slide here, and I've compiled a list of literature on this topic in no particular order. Just looking at their title tells us that there are various areas of inquiry on her thesis writing journey with key conversations around communities that support doctoral learning and writing, examiner practices and assessments, the processes and pedagogies of research writing, and the complex learning journey students cross as they develop a scholarly voice. Now, this work or this body of literature helps us understand not only what goes into a thesis, but also what gets left out. And that's the most important part, I think, how that agency, that expression, and even our emotions find their place or sometimes can be silenced within academic conventions. The body of literature around doctoral writing shows that writing is rarely just about us documenting our results. As Thiessen writes, and I'm quoting again his words, the thesis is much more than a product. It is a process of re-establishing the boundaries of knowledge in academia. Through writing, we don't just report what we found, we actually shape how knowledge itself is defined. So maybe the question we need to keep asking is this: how can we bring that messy human side of learning into the thesis without losing the rigor it demands? How might writing itself be viewed as a creative act, one that allows room for vulnerability, voice, and even reflection? This was something I found deeply challenging in the process of writing my thesis, but with support and guidance, I was able to include some part of this messiness into my work and even included a couple of images which captured a significant point in my data and analysis process. I like to think that learning to write a thesis is like learning to paint. So you've got that structure and technique, but there's also that interpretation, that experiment, and taking that risk. And sometimes what we want to cover up is equally as important as what we choose to show. So perhaps instead of asking how to make our research neater, we could ask, how can our thesis reflect the true, sometimes chaotic but deeply generative process of learning itself? Now, this brings us to the last part of my presentation, and we cannot not talk about AI anymore, right? So it's everywhere. It's in our email, it's in our literature searches, even in how we structure and polish our writing. And since the release of these generative AI tools, universities around the world and even schools have been grappling with what this means for academic integrity, authorship, and learning itself. As you can see from these images, I pulled some headlines from across the media, questioning whether essays are still meaningful assessments, and others exploring how educators can use AI to enhance learning rather than replace it. But what's clear is that AI is definitely transforming the way we write and how we create knowledge. And on this slide, you can see a few examples of AI tools researchers now use. It's just really mind-blowing. I've borrowed this from a page called Smart Researcher. There are so many out there you can actually try to find. From literature review generators to qualitative coding assistants, data visualizers, and even writing co-pilots that suggest tone, structure, and style. To think that we have all of these many options and capabilities today, I don't have these when I was doing my research, which I think is a good thing. So these tools challenge us to rethink what authentic scholarship means. And it raises a deeper question, isn't it? Like, if AI can help us write, where does that leave our voice? And that's where I want to return to what we've explored today. In the earlier sections, we talked about how art, whether in doodles or words, poetry, even metaphors, can help us think, can help us feel and make meaning. And art captures that human side of our learning, that reflection, that feeling of uncertainty, the connections we make when something resonates deeply with us. And AI certainly can help us to be more efficient in our writing, but I cannot feel our insights. I don't know, maybe not yet. We might get there at some point, but at least for now, it can't replicate that messy, emotional, personal journey of discovery that art allows us to do. So perhaps the question is not whether AI belongs in academic writing, it's how we as scholars and learners hold on to that creativity. How do we hold on to that individuality, that reflection amidst that that standardization and rigidness that AI might bring? How do we make space for us to be curious and for us to be uncertain, or how to create that light bulb moments that make research truly ours? So maybe the answer lies in balancing that, in letting AI support the technical side of writing, yes, while we nurture the artistic side of our thinking. And this question is is on the minds of a lot of educators these days, and educational institutions will have to try to answer this, perhaps by creating new assessment formats. So that's, I think, work in progress. That's already being done. Just bringing back to the last slide here and reflecting on what I've just presented and looking back on my own journey, I've come to see that writing a thesis is not just about reporting the findings, it's actually making meaning. Art became my way of thinking, a bridge between my own intuition and analysis and emotion and evidence. It helped me to see the patterns, make that connection, and shape the ideas in my research work. Now, as we step into the era of AI, I think that lesson feels even more important because while technology may enhance how we produce our knowledge, I think it's still our creativity and our curiosity and the capacity to be reflective that gives that knowledge depth and meaning. So perhaps the art of the thesis is not about perfection, it's about presence, being open to that evolving process of learning. And maybe that's where the future of academic writing could go, not just in what we produce and who we produce it for, but in how we create, connect, and make meaning along the way. And I'll end my presentation with that reflection. Thank you.
Oh, Vilo, thank you so much for sharing what was such a unique and interesting journey. I loved hearing about how doodling was a practice that accompanied you throughout your PhD. I'm curious though, was doodling a practice that you engaged with before the PhD, or did it emerge really as a meaning and sense-making practice once you started to engage in the learning?
I've been an avid doodler from my younger days, so I've been doodling quite a lot. But it became quite important in the work that I was doing during my research time. And what I used to doodle prior to doing my research was just merely drawing. And then I realized now the doodles that I was doing in my research were not just that. It was actually trying to shape my own understanding of the concepts that I was dealing with, or the emotions that I was feeling at that moment. Some of the images were a portrayal of my emotions at that very particular time. And it could be frustration or it could be anger. And then it transformed to, oh, I found a solution. I found an answer to this. I've come out of feeling like I was in the dark.
Yeah.
So a lot of that doodling became quite evident, especially in difficult or challenging times in the research. It's not always
Mm.
something that I did along that 4 years, but there were some moments where I started to doodle even more, and particularly during the data analysis time, which I found to be the most challenging point of my research.
You do it more. That's interesting. And you talked about how you selected some of those doodles to actually become part of your thesis. Um, can you talk about a little about that selection process? And was that challenging to identify uh, what you would select and what you would leave out?
Yes, I thought that was the most difficult part in terms of should I or should I not include an image as cartoonish as that into a very academic, professional piece of, writing that you're going to put out to the examiners. And and it was that selection process that made you think how much of that voice you're leaving out and how much of that you're including. And there were times I felt I could have put more of my artwork in it, but it didn't feel quite right because then it would not meet the requirements of a thesis format. And so that was a bit of a struggle there, but I had really good guidance and support from my supervisors who were allowing me to be expressive with my ideas, and at the same time making sure I met those requirements. So where I was describing those challenging moments in my PhD and research journey, that's where I would put an image in to support that idea and that expression of um, my challenges. And that fitted really well with, words accompanied by an image drawn by myself. But
Yeah.
one of the most significant point I think about using my own art was when I developed that conceptual framework. And that's an art that I produced myself,
Mm.
which until today I'm really proud of that work that translated what I experienced, just from going to the museum and getting that inspiration from that waka and making it into a framework that fitted really well with my data. So again, there was those little bits and moments where I needed to make those critical decisions and truly appreciated the support that I had from my supervisors who allowed me to just run with it.
Yes, yeah.
Mm.
And my final question, Vilo, is around doodling for you today. Do you still doodle in the work post PhD that you're undertaking? Is it still a practice that you draw on for your own sense making and meaning making and to assist you in what you're doing now?
Unfortunately, it's not coming as much as I would love for it to come out. I'm surprised myself. I think I've been so engrossed with work and things post PhD that creativity sort of I don't know, it's not being channeled through my drawings.
Yes,
Yet. That's right. So again, yes, I think it's that salience, isn't it? That critical experiences that you're experiencing at a particular time that makes you want to put your thinking onto paper. And so that's something that I experienced when I was doing the research, but not so much now because I feel like there's more free space in my head
of course, of
post
course.
PhD. So maybe I should start doodling again um, to find, I don't know, work I mean, ideas in my work. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a thought.
Absolutely. Well, Vilo, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I really appreciated you being so vulnerable in sharing your journey, but also offering us so many resources that we can now go to and further our own learning around some of the aspects that you've shared today. So, a big thank you.
Thank you.
And everyone, that brings us to the end of the series for HDR Create for 2025. It's been an absolute pleasure to be spending an afternoon a month with many of the very generous academics and colleagues who have shared their insights and their own learning journey. Vilo, thank you once again from all of us and to everybody else either here or watching on the recording. We look forward to catching up again in some way, shape or form in the future through the Create Centre. Thanks everyone. Bye for
Thank
now.
you, Susan.